Lesson number 2 is going to cover string settings. We're going to use box strings in the base form settings, and we'll get into things like twist and quick maps, and we'll also create a very cool looking reflection using the kaleidospace function of trapcode form. So I'll create a new composition. We'll call this form strings. I'm just using 640 by 480 to keep things quickly moving along. Now if I create a new solid, I'll make this my floor. And this is going to be 5000 by 5000, rather large, and I'm going to use an off-white for this. I'll make this a 3D layer and hit R to show my rotation and orient this 90 degrees in the X. I'll drag this down just a little bit. I'll make 2 lights, one an ambient light at 50%, and one a point light at 100%. Next, I will create my form layer by going to Layer New Solid. We'll call this Form. Let's make this the size of the comp. Hit OK, go to Effect, Trapcode Form. Now in the previous lesson, we studied the box grid. And that's what we see right here. This is the default setting. In this lesson, we are going to use box strings. Now let me solo this for a second and put this on a black background so we can see it. Now I'll create a camera for this scene. And if we orbit around, we'll see something pretty similar to what we saw before with the box grid. However, the box strings are basically a series of lines that are drawn horizontally. If I lower this strings in Y count to something like 10, we'll see that we've got 10 strings in the Y axis times 3, as we've got strings in Z set to its default value of 3. This is very similar to before, but you might notice that, well, this image is now being made of strings or horizontal lines rather than individual dots. So if I lower this count to just 1, we'll have one set of strings in the Z-axis, and just like before, I can adjust the size to make it larger in the X-axis as well as the Y-axis. Just like before, the size in Z is only going to affect more than one string in the Z-axis. I can go to the Disperse and Twist section here and turn up this twist value to make these strings twist along their axes. Now, the thing to remember with base form, like I mentioned in the last lesson, is that the base form is calculated first, and then everything is sort of calculated from the top down. So the size and center and rotation are all calculated first, and then the twist happens after that. So any rotation that I do is going to be calculated before the twist. This is where it starts to act a little bit outside of what you might think, because as you start to rotate this base form, the twist is going to happen after it. And it's just something you're going to have to get used to and play with, because again, the twist happens after the base form. I'm going to leave this to a mild rotation of -10, just to add a little bit of rotation to the base form and then have a little bit of twist happen to the base form after that. Now if I'd like to change the color of this, like you learned in the last lesson, I can go to the particle section and change the color of the particle. Now, as you learned, trapcode form generates imagery using a series of particles that have no birth or death time. They are always static. Even in the case of the box string setting, these are a series of particles strung together that form a string shape. And we can change the color of this particle to change the color of these strings. This is one way to do it. However, another way we can do this is by going to either the quick maps or the layer maps. Now the layer maps access external layers within our composition to be used as maps for any number of things like color and particle size. The quick maps are similar, however they do not require us to use an additional layer. Quick maps are contained within the plugin itself. So if I twirl this open, we can adjust things like particle opacity or particle color. I'm going to use the color map to adjust the color of this form shape. So if I twirl open this color map, we'll see a red to blue spectrum. Now I can apply this color map to a number of things. I can apply this along x-axis. If I zoom out with my camera to see this whole thing, we'll see that we've got the red that goes to orange and yellow, green to blue. So it's mapping across the x-axis like that. If I set this to y, it's going to map it up and down on the y-axis, and depending on how it's flipped, it will start with the red down to the blue, or from blue down to red. But it's up and down in the y-axis. Now if I set this to z, we're not going to see a whole lot right now. Again, we've got one string in z. If I set this to more than one string, like 5, we'll see that we've got the red, yellow, green, and etc. because this is mapping basically front to back. If I have one string in z, this is going to grab this middle color right here, which is this green. There's one more setting here called radial, which is more or less a gradient that emits in a radial fashion, starting with the red here and emanating outward to the blue. I'm going to use the y-axis here, and I'm going to use a preset that has two colors and change these two colors to a reddish orange, and I'll set the second color to something like a teal. Next, I'm going to unsolo this to see the rest of my objects, and from my original scene I'm going to steal the background that I used. This is simply a solid with a ramp applied so that we're not using a dark background. And I'm going to reset my camera and zoom back just a little bit. Now I'll orbit myself just a little bit to get an angle on this and move my camera into position just to get kind of a angled view on this. Now what I want to do is move this up a little bit. I'm going to adjust this center so that the whole object moves up in the scene like that. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom of our form settings here, or near the bottom, and look at this kaleidospace setting. We have the ability to mirror all of the particles that form makes in 3D space. So this isn't just a kaleidoscope effect, but it actually repeats all of the elements in 3D space. So if I set this to mirror horizontally, and I move this down a little bit, we can get kind of a reflection effect, because this is truly 3D, and as I move the camera around, this is going to look exactly like a 3D reflection. Now there are some tricks that we can do to get this to truly look like a reflection by blurring it and turning the opacity down, and that's what I'll quickly do next. I'm going to duplicate this floor and make this duplicate an adjustment layer. So anything visually underneath this layer here will have all of its effects applied to the layers underneath. So if I move this form layer below this floor adjustment layer, the area of this form that is below the floor we can add effects to. So this area down here will have something like, well, maybe a blur applied to it. So if I apply a fast blur and set this to something like 5 pixels, the area of the form that is underneath the floor will be blurred by 5 pixels. Now this is kind of a cheat. We do have to sort of position our camera and our form so that they kind of get in the right area. I've got this little area dipping underneath the floor there that I might want to adjust. And I'll do that by simply shrinking up this Y size a little bit and moving this center up a little bit more. Now I can move my camera around, and we'll see that the area under the floor is being blurred by the adjustment layer. Now if I'd like to add some transparency to that as well, I can again duplicate this floor I will move it immediately above the form layer. And what I want to do is look at my switches and modes by tapping F4, and I'm going to have the form layer use the floor layer as an alpha inverted track mat. And if I turn this opacity down just a little bit, bear with me. Now what I need to do is go to the original floor here and turn down the opacity there. This is kind of a cheat. We're making the floor semi-transparent, but it works just fine. Now it's kind of faint right now. Let me adjust this floor layer a little bit more. There. Now let me lessen the blur too on the adjustment layer so it's not quite as blurry. Let's set this to 2 pixels. And there you go. So a truly reflective looking, oops, you don't want to go underneath the floor, but a reflective looking wavy design element created with trapcode form. That gives you a basic understanding of the quick maps and the twist function in the disperse and twist, the kaleidospace, and a little bit more on the base form here using the box string setting.